Okay.
So we should probably start again.
Yay! Welcome back to the show. It's Louis, King Louis. He's not just the king of our hearts and the king of independent radical publishing, but he's also the king of ratings. Louis' episodes fly off the shelf, people. Louis knows this because I pester him and I say, Louis, do more content so I can get higher ratings. This is when like my Hollywood ponytail starts showing, like my slimy 90s guy agent, where it's like, give me ratings.
Sleazy producer
Yeah,
guy.
give me ratings. That's all I care about. But Louis, how you doing, man?
I'm okay. I find it hard to answer that question
Yeah,
honestly these days, but
that's true.
we carry on.
We carry on, and we're here. Um, we're here to talk about something related, obviously. And this is. I mean, it's going to be in the title of the show. So we're talking about Ghassan Kanafani, uh, world historic Palestinian intellectual, freedom fighter, activist, organizer, writer, scholar, and ultimately martyr, uh, who lives on in his writings. And you have been involved with publishing some of his work and writing about him. And we're coming up to July 8th. I'll publish this on July 8th, which is the anniversary of his martyrdom. And before we sort of get into that, I mean, before we talked on the mic, before we pressed record, we were talking about, the what does it mean to mourn a human life, a single human life? What does it mean to remember a single human life? I mean, we're a planet of billions right now. Now imagine that scaled historically, is that we're talking about like countless billions of human beings have lived on this earth and have been absorbed into it, its bones, whatever, dust. And to like think of like we end up thinking of some, and we remember some, a tiny fraction of them. So like the whole metaphor of stars has always been like really, I don't know, I love that metaphor for whatever reason because it really works in terms of there's this black, like chasm of nothingness, and then there's these things that stick out, these white stars, whatever, right? These shining stars that come out. And so that to me is, we think about that and this day about this guy. And so maybe at the outset, you can sort of answer that question like, why do we remember this guy?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny actually what you said before we started recording about what is the significance of an anniversary. I think that's a really interesting question, and I think personally speaking, significant anniversaries, specifically related to death, I'm always surprised each year how much more the loss is felt on the anniversary. Even though, as you said, it is just another day. Ultimately, there is something significant, I think, for a lot of people about remembering, even if it is just as you said, just as an excuse. I think there is something that it's commonly felt more on an anniversary. In terms of why Ghassan is remembered, I think, and actually, I make this point in the article I wrote that introduces the republication of Anni, his wife's tribute to him. I think Annie's tribute does an amazing job of, even only 1 year after answering your question just now. Because there's something about that tribute that captures extremely well Ghassan in his kind of many aspects, from the personal and the political, obviously, and the way in which those things are, not separate. And so Ghassan, when Ghassan was killed, that loss was felt by a host of people in different ways, from his young children and, the obvious confusion and heartbreak and mourning that they felt, as well as Annie, to colleagues like Georges Habash, to kind of, more broadly, even those that didn't know him personally. Because to be clear, Georges Habash was not just a kind of recent colleague of his in the PFLP. They had been close since the 50s, and their relationship was extremely close. But what Annie's tribute manages to do, I think it kind of captures the multifaceted nature of his loss and his importance, um, both as a father and as a husband, but also as a writer, a spokesperson, an artist, an inspiration, a comrade. And one of the ways she does that, obviously, is by incorporating the words of others. Whether it's an extremely heartbreaking letter written by Ghassan's son Fayez to him kind of after he was killed, or George Habash's letter that he wrote to her after he was killed, which is an unbelievably moving. Well, I mean, they're both unbelievably moving documents, and there's others, and there's also extracts from his own writing. So you can, even just from reading Annie's tribute, you can get an idea of the power and the lasting significance of his work. And actually, one very moving thing about that George Habash letter, which I don't know if a lot of people know, but George Habash couldn't go to Kanafani's funeral, which was an enormous public procession, one of the biggest kind of from that period of time in terms of like the number of people that went to it in Beirut. He couldn't go, and I knew he couldn't go, but I had assumed at some point it was for like security reasons or something. But it was because Habash had like almost died not long before because of heart troubles, and he was under like strict orders to recuperate, basically, and he was away somewhere, so he couldn't go to the funeral. And you can there it is, and you can feel the pain that he feels not being able to be there and not being able to support Annie in person. And as is often the way, kind of reading the tributes of people who knew someone best can often give you a real feel for their character and their importance and their standing, which often, tragically, people only write or people only say when someone is dead, which is, that's not unique to Ghassan. And, not that he wasn't appreciated in his life, he was, but he's taken, he was killed. On the day this goes out, he would have been killed 52 years ago. And, what I find most amazing is how relevant, how compelling all aspects of his writing, both fiction and non-fiction, remain right now. Just as an example, his short story letter from Gaza that she wrote in 1956, when he was working and living in Kuwait. Reading, and if anyone has not read that short story, I would highly recommend them to do so. It is very short as well. It's an unbelievably powerful kind of exploration of the choice that he faced, and so many Palestinians face and have faced and are facing right now. Of, is it better to flee or is it better to stay? And I don't really, if you haven't read it, I don't want to really kind of give away the ending, but he makes a kind of profound meditation on why he's staying, or why the character is staying, which I think, like a lot of his work, is there's certainly a part of him, if not entirely autobiographical, in that. Because that's something that's very clear in terms of his life. He was faced with the choice to stay or to go. And I don't mean that necessarily in the sense of being in Palestine literally, because obviously he was forced to flee when he was only 12. And actually, just incidentally on that, I learned recently that so the Kanafani family were from Akka, and when the Zionist forces came to Akka, they poisoned the water supply with typhoid. Um, and at the same time they were doing that, they were bombarding and shelling Akka as well. And then at the same time, they were also carrying out acts of like psychological warfare, loudspeakers saying surrender or commit suicide because we're going to kill you all, basically. So that's the circumstances under which the Kanafani family was forced to flee Akka via Lebanon, eventually reaching Damascus. So I think obviously one, in addition to his own uniqueness and importance, I think there is something about Kanafani's life that obviously there are universal themes in it related to exile and specifically the Palestinian experience. And even though he lived for a remarkably short time, given all that he did and achieved, the period in which he lived was a kind of extremely formative and important period within the Palestinian struggle. Even, for example, he was born just at the beginning of the Great Arab Revolt, which he wrote an excellent study of. Which actually, I should say, the introduction to that study, I think I've got it here somewhere. This recently republished version, the introduction to that by Layan Fulehan is really good, and I think kind of talks about quite a lot of the things we're talking about right now. But yeah, so from his date, from when he was born to on his 12th birthday, Der Yassin massacre took place, and according to Anni, he never liked to celebrate his birthday, which again speaks to that kind of what is the significance of anniversaries or not, because that obviously for him became permanently besmirched. And then he spent a period of time in Damascus, where he taught at a UNWA center, which funnily enough is something that actually I've also done myself. I don't think it was the same one physically, although I'm not actually sure it possibly could be the same like compound. And he then went to the Gulf and spent a number of years in Kuwait, which was like a very common journey for a lot of Palestinians. And obviously that informed the writing of Men in the Sun, which is probably his most read piece of fiction. And it was certainly the first thing that I read by him. And then at the request of Georges Habash, he left Kuwait and went to Beirut at the time in which Beirut began to become a kind of center of Palestinian revolutionary activity. And at that point in time, him and Georges Habash were obviously Arab nationalists, explicitly, part of the movement of Arab nationalists founded by Georges Habash and others. And then after 1967 and the kind of damage to the image of and the kind of perceived strategy of the Arab nationalist cause, they then went on to establish the PFLP. And then he was in the PFLP for 5 years before he was killed in 1972. Established Al-Hadaf, the PFLP's paper, in 1969, and was the editor of it. So I think, the one answer to why is he remembered so much is obviously his remarkable output, both in terms of fiction and non-fiction. And obviously a point that I've made on this podcast before when we spoke about the translation of on-Zionist literature is, and I think this is being redressed to some extent now, especially with, the forthcoming collected political works that is coming out. Our own effort with on Zionist literature, the retranslation of the 3639 study. I think there is definitely been a kind of re-interest, which is exactly what I wanted to happen and I felt deserved to happen. So both his political and non-political work is extremely important, extremely relevant, but then also his biographical kind of life story. There are universal things within it about the Palestinian experience and about the kind of charting the trajectory of Palestinian revolutionary politics. And I think one of the ways in which sometimes the way in which he's been remembered, and still is, although I think it is getting better, is that political trajectory and that political context has often been obscured or distorted or sometimes just outright ignored in some ways. So, just for that as an example, Kanafani was explicitly in favor of armed struggle. And actually something that I think is forgotten or perhaps not known now is the tactic of the PFLP in the late 1960s of hijacking planes was extremely controversial, even kind of within the movement broadly defined. And I think was actually opposed by both China and the Soviet Union. I don't think like publicly, but behind the scenes, and many and kind of other factions from within the Palestinian national movement, kind of generally. But Kanafani was adamant about their value and their worth and importance, and never questioned them. And I think another thing that as well is important to understand in that context is the way in which the Palestinian cause is known now. It was incomparable then. It was just not known about to the extent that it is now. And that was actually one of Kanafani specifically, and the PFLP generally, one of their justifications. And I think in 1970, in an interview, Kanafani said basically, when we hijack a plane, it has more effect than if we kill 100 Israeli soldiers. World public opinion has essentially ignored, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but world public opinion has essentially ignored the Palestinians for decades, and now they're talking about us. It wasn't the only means of armed struggle that he endorsed, obviously, and actually he felt pertinently, given the contemporary situation, he felt particularly inspired by the prospect and the reality of armed struggle after he visited Gaza in 1966 and met with commandos there at the time that were being trained by Egypt. Because that's another key turning point is around, it kind of went into overdrive post 67, but from 1964 and the creation of the PLO, and there began to be kind of more independent Palestinian political activity, not solely under the direct control or rubric of other Arab states. But I do think as well, it's also important to remember, and I think, this is something that has been lost in a lot of the ways in which he's remembered, is he was, explicitly in favor of armed struggle, rejected what he called, kind of bourgeois morality. He understood extremely well, as was, the PFLP's position, the central role of US imperialism in the Palestinian struggle, but also never kind of rejected the pan-Arab regional element of understanding the cause as well. Occasionally it's spoken about as if, quite simplistically, overnight, post 1967, they switched from Arab nationalism to Marxist Leninism and like completely dismissed Arab nationalism, but that's not what happened at all. It was much more complicated and nuanced than that. So I think, I mean, this is a very, very rambling response to why do we remember him. But I think, there are many, many reasons. And I think, like I say, I think it's improving, but there have been issues with the way in which he's remembered. Although something quite ironic occurred to me actually this morning, because obviously I knew we were going to record this. I think at times when I've spoken about this, I've done something which I don't actually didn't intend or don't agree with, which because of the passion I felt about how his non-fiction needs to be considered, needs to be read, needs to be translated, etc. I think at times I've done that, even though I do remember saying, this is not to say his fiction is unimportant, because it absolutely is not, and in fact, drawing a clear distinction between them is I think a false thing to do. Um, at times, I've probably said things like, he wasn't just a writer, or he wasn't just this, and this particularly came to mind when Refaat Alareer was assassinated, because, and the reason that came to mind is because as soon as I heard that devastating news, like within seconds, I thought of Ghassan. Um, and maybe we can speak about that in a minute, the kind of the parallels between Rifat and Ghassan. And I wrote a piece about those parallels for Electronic Intifada a day or two after Rifat was killed. But one thing, and I quoted it in that piece, that Rifat spoke about in a lecture in 2019. He says, I'll quote directly. He says, "Of course, we always fall into this trap of saying she," and in this context, he's talking about Fadwa Turan, "was arrested for just writing poetry. We do this a lot, even us believers in literature. We say, why should Israel arrest somebody or put someone under house arrest? She only wrote a poem." So we contradict ourselves sometimes. We believe in the power of literature changing lives as a means of resistance, as a means of fighting back. And then at the end of the day, we say, she just wrote a poem. We shouldn't be saying that. And he goes on, but I won't quote any further. And I think um, I've probably been guilty of that framing sometimes over the past few years, especially, in like, for example, I don't know, in tweet format, which forces you to be more kind of succinct than you might like to be. Um,
Wait,
but
in
I
the
think
sense
that
of,
point,
do you mean you're guilty of dismissing literature and also hyping it up? Okay, so this
yeah,
is something that I thought about a lot too, because it's we have this problem, and this is where the humanity guy comes in, and he says that what happens to a human life when it's absorbed back into the earth is that it's the remnants of that life are textualized. And if that means, this is the scarf of my aunt and she handed down to me and she used to wear it and she used to, here's a picture of her, right? Like these are all texts, like the scarf and the picture and also the story we tell about her. Right. So in the case of intellectuals and writers and cultural figures and dare I say podcasters, um, and it's a larger question about the sort of mimetic representation of the world that like media allows us to do, depending on what that media is over time, is that there is this immortality of the text, right? There is this perceived, if not actual immortality of the text. Like our bodies die, like the carbon or whatever, this like machine of life ends the way anything ends, and the text lives on. But the way it lives on is interesting. And there's actually a story that the Kanafani, I mean, the sort of story of, like, say, the Palestine Research Center that you mentioned, is an attempt to erase Palestinian textuality because it was first and foremost an archive of texts about Palestine or whatever, right? And so, like, this is a question that I always have: is that, like, what does it mean to reduce a human life to texts? What does it mean to say, oh, we mourn Frantz Fanon for his words and his actions and his martyrdom for a greater cause, but we don't think of, sorry, insert random Algerian name here, like that the sort of In Persian we say "Aghay Janabali," like whoever so and so. Like we don't remember him. We don't. We from far away, right? Because his life's act transcended, this permanent subtextuality, and he absorbed himself back into like the fold of his nation. Now, in the latter's case, in this case of this, fictional Algerian freedom fighter, the tangible result is the freedom of the country, right? Which to this day is one of the few Arab countries that hasn't accepted the Zionist entity, that hasn't recognized it, and it's still punished to this day, right? And so, like, this is an interesting thing to consider. Like, why do guys like Rafat and Ghassan, like their lives stick out, but they stick out to us, right? Because this is our domain, reading and publishing and textuality and criticism and literature and whatever. Their lives stick out to us and we need them. And so, like, and then you think to yourself, well, a writer doesn't like hold a gun, right? Like a writer can't face down this monstrous genocidal military machine, right? Like Rafat said it himself in his beautiful spot on Electronic Intifada. He's right, like, all I have is this marker, right? Like, and that's all I have. That's the only weapon I have, right? So, like, the words themselves are the weapon because the very idea of Palestine frightens them, right? Like, it frightens them so much, and they need to suffocate it as much as they need to suffocate Palestinians who are resisting, right? And Palestinians who just exist also. So there's something in that I wonder about. That, like, is this a double? Like, what is it about the immortality of the text? But is it a kind like, or is it just because this is our class of people? These are the things that we value.
One thing I'll just say immediately is I recently discovered a book called Afterlives: Legacies of Revolutionary Writing by Barbara Harlow. And she looks at three different revolutionary writers and martyrs and their kind of the legacy of their writing. And one of them is Kanafani. I literally only managed to find a PDF of it yesterday, so I haven't read it all yet, but it seems very good so far and discusses exactly these kind of things. I mean, I think one thing that underlines some of what you were just saying there is, of course, the understanding that resistance is a continuum and multifaceted series of things that really without armed struggle and armed resistance is severely weakened, and armed resistance and armed struggle is the core of it, but they are not competing things. There's an amazing quote from Samir Idris, who basically says exactly that point. That we shouldn't set these things up as competing; they're complementary. And I've certainly felt that at times. Like, sometimes if I have criticized the solidarity movement for not being in support of armed struggle, people kind of, and this is happened more than once, get very defensive about the importance of BDS. But nothing I've said has implied that BDS is also not important and it's one or the other. And I think this same point is kind of applies to and is reminiscent sometimes of the discussion of Kanafani and non-fiction and fiction. Me saying, even though I might have inadvertently done this accidentally at times, me saying his non-fiction and his political stances and his political writing has been neglected and obscured is not saying that his fiction is unimportant. But you can't, to get Kanafani, if you want to talk about remembering, and I think remembering as honestly and as accurately as possible is incumbent upon us. You can't do that by only looking at a certain element of someone's corpus, whoever we're talking about. And I do think there is a kind of correction under like kind of happening. And actually, I was interested. The piece that I wrote to introduce the republication of Anni's introduction, that got translated into Arabic And I was speaking to the person who commissioned that translation, a Palestinian in Jordan, and he was saying that the things that I speak about that in terms of like the way in which Kanafani has been defanged and somewhat rendered, as is, as we spoke about briefly before we started recording, this is not unique to Kanafani. Dead revolutionaries are very often, Lenin spoke about this in like 1915 in a way that still applies absolutely. They are rendered safe. They are intentionally portrayed in a way that plays down their contemporary relevance and their political commitments and often their militancy. So what has happened to Kanafani is not unique, but I was surprised by the extent of which I do and have read stuff about him in Arabic, but he was saying it's not unique to the Anglosphere. This has also happened in the Arab world. Hence his desire to translate and publish my piece. But having said that, I think one of the best things that I found during the kind of research and reading for that piece is a piece wrote by, let me just find his name, Nasser Ibrahim, who decades later, after Kanafani, also served as editor of Al Hadaf. And just even the title of that piece alone, I'll just try and translate it quickly. It's like he was neither a saint nor a fixed or like static icon. He was a revolutionary fighting for life. And he kind of expounds at length upon the dilemma that Kanafani faced, or multiple dilemmas. And actually, Ibrahim also says that Kanafani was a kind of true Gramscian organic intellectual. And I'll just read a little bit actually of what he says, because he basically says Kanafani faced great choices and questions in a harsh, difficult, bitter, and bloody reality. He had to choose, knowing in advance that each option had its own costs. Ghassan had, at a crucial moment, to choose between facing the contradictions and challenges that express the reality and resistance of the Palestinian people, to engage in it personally, or to only be an intellectual who follows and interacts with what is happening from afar. He had to choose between being an active and organic participant in the resistance, with all the risks and direct costs that entails, or continuing his life as a writer in the context of daily life, where it is difficult, if not impossible, to be aware of the true spirit of the Palestinian experience from outside. That is why Kanafani had to choose, so he chose his fate. And I think that also came to mind when I got the news of Refaat's assassination, because in both cases, in slightly differing ways and reasons, but in both cases, had it been their priority, both of them would have been able to get to a safer place. But that was not their priority. And they chose to stay in situations, again, in slightly differing ways, that, if not certainly, there was, a very significant chance of being killed. And they both made that choice. And I think they probably made that choice for similar reasons. And actually, another good piece I'd recommend people read is something that Ahmed Faleh wrote for Ebb magazine, called A Productive Language on Western Intellectual Paradigms and Refaat Alareer. And in that, he explores a lot of things we're talking about now, and the way in which Refaat chose to the people, basically chose his people and the cause, not the furtherance of his academic career or safety, or the immediate
His
safety of
life,
him
yeah,
him
his
and his.
life, and his also his family's life. These Zionists attack their families too. I mean, they've killed 19 members of what's his name, of Hania's family. Is it Hania's family? Yeah, it's Hania's family.
It's min
Yeah,
Haniya, yeah.
like the Zionists will make an example of anyone whose name rises to prominence. They go after the stars. They want to nuke the sky of Palestinian life, and like that's the goal. And that's like Rifat was a big thorn in their side. He had a massive following. He was very effective with their billions and
Yeah.
billions and dollars of PR and marketing, with their tens of thousands of busy bodied little monsters working across the globe to obfuscate their crimes or to sell them as heroic victories. Like that one guy with like a marker and a Twitter account like became a hero to millions of people who saw his tweets. I mean, like that's something that like first of all, it's a reminder of what the stakes are in this. Is that you're talking about, on the one hand, the Death Star country called Zionism, right? And then the other country is like this heroic uprising people who refuse to be cowed, to refuse to like to be cowed and into submission, who refuse to like who through their darkest times. And remember, I mean, as you put it out, Kanafani lived through the darkest period of Palestinian national history. Okay, that period is the darkest, from the Nakba to the Naksa, right, to like the bleakness of the 70s. Could you imagine what it was like in like, and then the peak of that, interestingly enough, is like what, 78 with Oslo, with Camp David, right? Suddenly one of their main backers pulls out, right? Like they're kicked out of Beirut. Well, Beirut, actually, they're still in Beirut at that time. But then, like, you move forward to like 1982, they're besieged in Beirut. They were kicked out, and then go and take refuge in Tunisia. And of course, that begins the long, slow process of Oslo. I mean, this is a bleak, bleak time for Palestinian resistance that he lived through.
Well, he did, but he also did live through and obviously participate in the beginnings of a Palestinian resistance that was not dependent, uh, you know, increasingly by necessity as time went on, but was not dependent on the support entirely, at least, of, or not even the support, the permission or control of the larger Arab states. There was just something you said about when Rifat was killed, which made me think of something that was said, after, just in the immediate aftermath of Ghassan's killing. This An Israeli journalist who was like a close ally of Sharon wrote in, what's it called, Martyrdom, the Israeli newspaper, and he, because as much as killing Ghassan was about Ghassan, it was also a message to others. And he's and this guy who was basically a mouthpiece of the state said Palestinian members of the front, i.e. the PFLP, should be under the impression that Israel can strike anywhere. The killing of Kanafani must be a clear warning to them, but the killing of Kanafani must not be an isolated action. Now more than ever before, the Palestinian leaders must be open to personal terrorism. The killing of Kanafani shows that this is possible, that it can be carried out, and that it involves no particular difficulties. And I mean, they're true to their word. They very much continued that campaign. And there's this amazing anecdote. One of the PLO's kind of most renowned intellectuals and spokespeople was a guy called Kamal Nasser. And when he read the eulogy that Mahmoud Darwish wrote for Kanafani, which is incredible, he is said to have kind of complained to Darwish, like, kind of joking, but not like, what more can a poet write after this? What is there left for you to say when I'm killed? And less than a year after that, he was killed.
And Edward Said was with him that night, and they had separated. because Edward Said forgot his passport. Something, there's a story. Edward Said could have been assassinated that night too if they were together, which is a crazy thought.
And that was in the infamous like Verdun massacre.
And Steven
Um,
Spielberg made that
which,
crew into like a loving biopic in Munich. And it's sick. It's sick. Their crimes, they celebrate their crimes. They enshrine their crimes into texts.
you know who led that? Do you know who led that
Ehud
death
Barak,
squad?
dressed in
Yeah,
women's clothing. And they
yeah,
celebrated him, and he used that to help elect him. Right? But here's the crazy irony: that guy is incompetent. That guy is bad for Zionism. Like, this is the funny thing. All of these dudes who made their names killing Palestinians, like the boomer Zionists that we know their names of, not the subsequent generation, like scum Netanyahu. Like, Netanyahu isn't part of that generation. Netanyahu is a bureaucrat and a slimy politician. He's not from their traditional power centers, which is the military, right? Like, for all of his
well, and he grew up in
yeah, like he's a
Philadelphia as
Philly
well.
boy. He's a Philly boy elite representative of a certain kind of Zionism that he like finagle. That's why he's more hated inside of Israel by Zionists than he is outside by anti-Zionists. Like, he's reviled, and yet he's their greatest politician, whether they like it or not. Like, this is something that
Yeah,
I think about a lot in terms of the exemplar that that the Kanafani, Kamal Nasser, or Refaat, these guys have a fraction of the, say, publication power that Zionists enjoy, right? Like, Palestinians don't have like a direct line to all the major news publications of the West the way that Zionists do. That they don't have like New York Times and CNN run their articles through Israeli censors first, right? But Palestinians don't enjoy such a luxury, and so they build up their own platforms, they build up their own publications and their own attempts to sort of send their message out to their world, and they're more successful. Show me one Israeli writer who has a fraction of the following and the love that Refaat himself with his Twitter account had, with his Twitter account and his YouTube, right? Like, part of the
yeah.
reason why they kill like this isn't just political, but there's a deeper psychological mechanism in Zionism. It says that we wish we had these types of like organic intellectuals, right? We wish we had
And
that. We can't have that. And actually, that makes me think about something that this is something that Sharice Burden-Stelly said recently. I'll show it. There are no. This is This is on Twitter. Let me just share the screen. Not that I'm going to use this, but what's the point? Share. So it says there. This is Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly. She said there are no burdens. There are no burdens. There are no heroes in academia, but countless enemies. None. The best in the industry strive to be guerrilla intellectuals and to commit class suicide. Those who are most successful falter and fail all the time, but always toward a better methodology to keep trying. So I've read this in like different ways to myself over the last few days. Like, it's had this lingering effect on me because, like, especially in the last 9 months, but also before that, and really, it's like my podcast is like a chronicle of this, of like a slow disillusionment with the intellectual class, but the intellectual class of the West. Okay, which is the class that I know, which is the class that forged me on their foundry of evil, called university, right? Like, that are like drenched in the blood of so many indigenous people whose wealth is generated from stolen indigenous land, who appropriate ideas from revolutionaries all the time, who's like, this is like the story of the West, and I am a child of that. You are a child of that. Like, we are, like, the way we write, the way we think, the way we compose our thoughts, our tweets. This is a product of our education system and our imperialist knowledge system. And it's not our fault. It's not, a reflection of our ethics. It's not like, it's just a matter of history. We didn't have a choice of like where we were educated. We didn't have a choice of like how we were formed. And so there is something though that this tweet by CBS really pulls up, which is like, there are no heroes because the institutions themselves are the evil ones. That's the bad place. This is where, despite what we may think about the potential to take them back, right? And like these encampments are a great example of that, like which are important. And I'm not shitting on them to any extent, but like these institutions belong to power and they always will. And we're not talking master's tools, dismantle in master's house. We're talking
They
they
are
are
power.
power, man. It's where it's made. Like there's more compradors minted from these places than there are Palestinian, like pro-Palestine revolutionaries. Now, with that being said, guys like Refaat and like connected with EI, with the wonderful people at Electronic Intifada, who themselves are also like us, products of the Western knowledge system, but who then defected, committed a kind of class suicide in a sense. It's a kind of career suicide to write about Palestine. It's a career suicide to talk about resistance, right? And then that's
It's career suicide to write about
oh
Palestine
yes, that's true.
in an
Yes,
in an honest
yes, yes,
way.
yes, yes. That's true. I should have said
It's
that.
a good
It's true.
it's a good career
Yeah.
choice, or it's a career choice. If you know
Yeah, that's
if you
true.
stay within these
We should do
parameters,
it up.
you'll do pretty
Yeah,
well.
that's true. I mean, that's a different story. Yeah, that's
Um,
also a story about the appropriation of liberation struggles inside of the West as a proxy, as an attempt to salve the very fact that like Zionism is our history. Right, like we are Zionism is a reflection of our history. That like we are the Zionists to a degree. We are that project, like unfolding here. And so, like, there's nothing, which is not to cheapen the crimes of Zionism. Zionism is a very unique and bloody and bloodthirsty, like, chapter in the book of settler colonial history for sure, right? But like, there is an attempt to use Palestine to wash away the sins of the land grant universities. I mean, the land grant university, like, if people don't know what it is, like, go look it up. Like, this is a factory of evil. It takes stolen land and manufactures wealth which it uses to reproduce itself. And so I've had this thought.
let me
Okay,
interrupt
go
you
ahead.
for 1 second, because you've said multiple things which I want to just comment on, and also to bring it back to Ghassan slightly. Um, I think one thing, and something you said about Rifat kind of alludes to this, is that what's very clear is that, at least on however they might express it or rationalize it, the Israelis understand the danger, understand very well the danger that it's not only the people with the guns in their hands that are a threat. Um, they understood that very well, um, and actually, that's something which Annie, in the tribute that I've already mentioned, she expresses very clearly and very powerfully, um, because she was under no illusions about why he was killed. Um, I just want to find it. Actually, I can't actually find it, but she basically says you could express in simple, clear terms uh, political concepts and the Palestinian cause in such an effective way. And obviously, like Rifat, Ghassan could also do this in English. And that's why they had to get rid of you, basically. I think she refers to them as the enemies. That's why the enemies had to kill you. I found it now belatedly. She says, you were able to explain in simple terms the most difficult political ideas. That is why people listen to you, read your articles and books, and will continue to do so. And that is why the enemies had to destroy you. And that goes for, I think it's, and one point I make in the introduction to Annie's tribute, which I don't think we've spoken about explicitly, but I think is really important. Kind of two interrelated things. You can't, or we shouldn't, exceptionalize Kanafani's assassination. It can only be understood. And I think there's two particular important contexts to understand it in. One, a specific context of serial Israeli assassination and targeting of intellectuals, poets, artists, writers, etc. Because as I was just saying, they understood very well the threat that they posed. Um, even for example, I think 2 weeks after Kanafani was killed, the director of the Palestine Research Center, which published on Zionist literature and numerous other extremely important publications, a man called Anni, he was sent a letter bomb in the post, which he opened, and he was severely injured, but survived. And like I said, about a year after Ghassan was killed, Kamal Nasser and several others with him were killed, and that continued on, and continues, to this very moment. Israel knows the threat that organic revolutionary intellectuals pose to the Zionist project. But the other thing, and actually I was really amazed to see the book I only discovered in the last couple of days by Barbara Harlow. She does a very, very similar thing to I do, and even names some of the same people, which is that Kanafani's assassination has to be understood in the kind of broader politics of the time, which were, for essentially, I mean, it's difficult to bookend it exactly, but throughout the 60s and the 80s, there was a global wave of counter-revolutionary assassinations, because during that era, as you were correctly saying, even though in many ways it was a grim era of Palestinian national liberation struggles history, it was also kind of somewhat paradoxically a period of anti-colonial victories, most prominently in Algeria and Vietnam. And it was a period of successful decolonization. There were periods of sustained kind of unrest in the US, and there was the political, military, and ideological counterweight provided by the Soviet Union, and the global hegemony of Western imperialism. And Kanafani spoke about and understood this very well. His famous quote about striking imperialism anywhere and you strike it. So within that period, an unbelievable list and number of people, quite a kind of broad range of people in terms of their politics to some extent, but it was essentially, a really vicious counter-revolution, and a key component of that counter-revolution was the assassination of revolutionary leaders and intellectuals. And yeah, like I say, Barbara Harlow named some of the specific people that I named to kind of contextualize Kanafani's killing. And Annie does the same in her tribute. Actually, she places him in the tradition of Patrice Lumumba and Che Guevara and others. But I, and also Barbara Harlow, mentioned Walter Rodney, Amilcar Cabral. Cabral was killed a year after Kanafani. Allende was one way or another killed 1 year after Kanafani. Steve Biko was killed a couple of years later. Fred Hampton had only been killed a couple of years before Kanafani. So, I think it's very important to place his killing in that context. Both the specific, i.e. Israel, with the full support of the US, it's kind of, essentially global campaign of violence and assassination against the Palestinian liberation movement and all of its components, but then also this broader counter-revolutionary campaign, a key component of which was assassinations exactly like Kanafani's. So I think it has to be understood in that context. The other thing I wanted to say is that you mentioned class suicide, which obviously was a call made and a concept expanded upon by Cabral. And Ahmed, in the article I mentioned earlier, speaks about that, and gives a kind of other examples in addition to Refaat, who kind of exemplify that notion of class suicide. And I think there's something to say, kind of, especially in the Western academic context, the choices that Refaat, Ghassan, and so many other Palestinians were forced into, the kind of dilemmas that they faced, which were very literally life and death. Not everyone, for various reasons, is going to be faced with such stark choices. But even from the, the relative comfort and safety of the West, people are still faced with these choices. And in some cases, it's not life and death. It's being considered serious and respectable and professional or not. It's being ridiculed by colleagues, broadly defined, or not. It's damaging your chances of a promotion or another job or not. And it's choosing to toe the line on, Syria being an obvious example of or whatever it may be or not. It's choosing silence or not on things that one way or another, where it's you're gonna be attacked by newspapers, or you're gonna be, I don't know, ridiculed on social media or whatever it may be. There are less dramatic choices that are being made all the time. And what are you prioritizing? Your kind of standing, your perceived respectability, which we know that perceived respectability is essentially boils down to, are you actually anti-imperialist in the moment that it's happening in a specific way, or are you just generally in the abstract, oh, imperialism is / was bad, and are you willing to demonize past and present enemies of the US one way or another? So I don't think not being in a life and death situation absolves people from being honest with themselves that they are also making decisions which are comparable, even if the result of what decision you make is significantly less dramatic and dangerous.
I mean, yeah, there is also something that we kind of alluded to, but there's something else that happens in the West with relationship to the with guys like Kanafani and the names you listed off, right? Is that first of all, there becomes, after their deaths, usually untimely, there's like there's like a period of time that's allowed, that's sort of given, and then you're allowed to say good things about them. Then you're allowed to celebrate them and then write books about them and whatever, right? And so there is a weird, and I think this is what happens especially in the West, because in the rear view, as people's lives, as like people sort of grow smaller in the rear view, then the specifics of what they said and the specific contextual details of their lives and how they interacted with the world around them during it, those go away, and what's left are the texts, right? And so your ability to lift that person out of the text, to thread a human being out of the text, becomes crucial to how that person gets remembered by the reader of your study, right? And so, like, this is
Yeah.
something that all authors do. This is what I did. Like, when I wrote about Charles Dickens in chapter 2 of my dissertation, like, I stitched together this image of this man, who did this and did that or whatever. And then, I mean, I'll mind you, like, what's at stake in representing Charles Dickens is much different than what's at stake in representing Ghassan Kanafani, right? Because in the end, one is celebrated as a symbol of national glory and beautiful writing and criticism and publication and being a journalist, and the other one is known as, like, oh, this guy who worked for the PFLP as their main spokesperson, right? That, like, it's reductive and it's reduced to that, like, little labor PFLP. Not to disparage the
But I
PFLP.
mean, in many cases, the PFLP connection is
Yeah,
not
yeah,
even really
because I
acknowledged.
think, yeah,
And also as well, he was not just, and maybe I shouldn't say just, but he was not solely the PFLP spokesperson. He was extremely involved in writing, their actual political
yeah.
analysis and positions.
No, he was
Not long before he died, he wrote a kind of basically a strategy document called Tasks for the New Stage. And I think, just to give you an example, I think of the sometimes stark disconnect between the politics of people who would celebrate Kanafani in this kind of basically almost like kind of liberalized, defanged way, to the reality of the kinds of things that Kanafani, Habash, and the PFLP were writing, reading, being inspired by. From at least 1970, if not before onwards, the Al Hadaf and PFLP generally, and George Habash actually visited in 1970, were extremely inspired, interested, and engaging with the DPRK, and the model, the revolutionary model. Obviously they were inspired by Vietnam and by Mao, but they were also regularly translated. I don't actually know who would have done the translation. That's an interesting question in itself. But publishing translations, for example, of speeches and articles by Kim Il Sung, and were very much connected to and engaging with the DPRK. DPRK provided arms to the PFLP directly in this period, and as we've probably discussed at some point, or certainly someone you've had on the show would have, DPRK currently is probably about the most lied about, demonized, ridiculed country on planet Earth, many times by people who would identify as being on the left, whatever that means,
Watermelon emojis, big time,
and probably have some kind of positive association with Kanafani. And I'm not saying that to remember someone positively you have to exactly share their political positions. Obviously not. And like the piece by Nasar Ibrahim says, it's not about portraying Kanafani as this, kind of, as an icon. It's not about hagiography, or deifying or fixing them in some. And it's also not about trying to say like, oh well, what would his stance be about this now? I don't think that's a particularly useful.
Karl Marx failed to consider posts.
Yeah. But what you can do with someone like Kanafani, whose record is so clear, he would not have partaken in, accepted, endorsed rabidly racist, imperialist representations of the DPRK. You can say that with probably 100% confidence. Whereas a lot of people who would have a positive opinion, let's say, of Kanafani, or to some extent, would be very quick to laugh at, dismiss, or ridicule North Korea, quote unquote. Whereas the PFLP was literally visiting, engaging with, receiving arms from the DPRK in the years leading up to Kanafani's assassination. And, some people might think this is a slightly random example, but it's an example of the way in which he has often been remembered in a certain way. And, as well, I think this is something that I think the PFLP, again, I think there's a movement away from this, and I think it has changed to some extent, but especially in academia, PFLP are often treated as a kind of like quaint relic. And revolution and armed struggle is something that, if it's in the 60s or 70s, it's easy to kind of glorify and celebrate.
Especially if they're Marxists.
Yeah. But, you as well as I do, the PFLP are active fighting right now. And they're in a close alliance with Hamas. They're in a close alliance with Islamic Jihad. They're close and good relations with Iran, with Hezbollah. And, even though they're not as prominent as they once were, they are still struggling and still fighting in a literal sense. But that kind of contemporary ongoing struggle is often, whether it's talking about the PFLP or whether it's talking about Kanafani, that connection is often intentionally or not. I think sometimes it is, sometimes it's just maybe ignorance or kind of general framing is really obscured. Whereas, you've got PFLP officials literally still naming Kanafani as, they're in the list of their martyrs that they're still fighting for. And I think it's that frustration I felt at times, which maybe at times has made me say things like, he wasn't just a writer, or unintentionally downplayed the significance of his fiction. And I remember saying, when we did the episode about on science literature, I remember saying that wasn't that is not what I'm saying. But I do think there's probably moments at which, even in just conversations with people, that I have maybe unintentionally done that, because obviously his fiction is intensely political. In addition to being incredible literature, and his output was varied and unbelievable, it's explicitly political. And there's the famous quote of his saying, my politics and me being a novelist are basically indivisible. And actually, I kind of he basically says, my I was initially a novelist, and the politics kind of came because of that.